All right, welcome everybody. Whoever's joining us here through the Kelly Writers House YouTube live stream. This is sponsored by the UPenn Kelly Writers House. My name's Dick Pullman, and I teach in the creative writing program and write a political column at dickpullman.net. And today we're hosting Damon Linker, who you also see on your screen. Hopefully he's a senior correspondent at theweek.com and writes a national political column there, which I highly advise you all to check out. And here at Penn, also, he's a lecturer in the critical writing program. So he's close to home. He's also written for the New Republic and Newsweek, Daily Beast, and other wonderful places, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. But here we're focusing on the here and now. So we are 1 week out from this election, as everybody knows, and I don't know whether everybody out there is gritting their teeth or biting their nails or diving under the pillow or some variation thereof. We all have our ways of coping. So we're going to talk for a little bit, and hopefully there'll be some questions coming through that we can entertain, as it were. So I wanted to just ask Damon, just the question I think that everybody is asking right now of themselves and of their friends, which is basically, what do you think is going to happen next Tuesday?
Don't I wish I knew? But of course, I'm here to say more than that. I mean, my outlook is to treat this very much as a matter of probabilities. If you look at the polls and you do not assume that we are in the grip of the worst polling error in human history, then Joe Biden should win. And it should not really be close. It should not be as close as it was 4 years ago when, as you all, I'm sure, remember, maybe some of you are a little traumatized one way or the other, but 4 years ago, Trump won by winning the Electoral College by about 80,000 votes scattered across 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And in all the demographic groups that allowed him to do that, Trump has sunk in support. And at the level of the national vote, the polls were not that inaccurate. They said going into the final day that Hillary Clinton should win by about 3 points, and she won by about 2 points in the national vote. Of course, Trump won in the Electoral College, but the polls have consistently shown at the national level that Biden is leading by anywhere from 8 to 10 points. And this has been going on for literally months. So if you assume that 4 years ago is a baseline for a squeaker for Donald Trump to win, we're nowhere near that squeaker situation now. So I guess my safe bet prediction is that Biden should win. Then the question we could talk through, if you want me to, like the various paths from that, where, on one hand, it's a landslide and it's obvious by like 8 o'clock because Biden wins Florida by 5 points. Florida will be really the most important, crucial state to look at because it's been very close. It usually is very close. If Biden can win there pretty decisively, and also the thing about Florida is they start counting their mail-in and early ballots early. So unlike, for instance, here in Pennsylvania, where we might not know the final outcome for like a week or two, because they don't really start counting at least the late arriving ballots until after Election Day. So here we might not know for quite a while if it's sort of close within a few percentage points. In Florida, we should know by around 8 or 9 o'clock. If Biden has won Florida, it is, I would say, almost impossible for Trump to win overall. On the other hand, if Trump wins Florida, that doesn't mean that Biden loses the whole thing, but it does mean we're going to be in for a much longer night and conceivably a multi-day affair. So that's the first thing I'd look for.
Well, and I know we're kind of skywriting here. There's no way we can be definitive about any of what we're talking about. But Is there, in your mind anyway, some kind of magic margin by which, if Biden wins by a sufficiently decisive amount, that it will be virtually impossible for Trump to claim that it's rigged and that he's, I don't know, making noises about refusing to leave, or God knows what the rhetoric would be like. Is it 8 points? Is it 10? Is it 12? I mean, and who would put the pressure on him to basically say, look, this is over. Let's transition.
Well, let me reverse your premise a little bit there. I would say the margin for Trump making a big mess of this and trying to say muddy the waters enough that he could try to claim he can stay in office is actually very small. I think if you, and I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this, have a history of watching election returns on an election night. You watch the news, whether it's CNN, MSNBC, or even Fox, which obviously has a big dog in the fight for the Republicans. You know that they have people on there who know their job. They know their business. You see what happens around 8, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. They're touching the screen and like blowing up counties and showing you the margin as it's coming in different counties. These people know what to expect, and they are going to know what is happening, and they're going to say it. Even at Fox, they're going to be showing you counties in Arizona and in Michigan, outside of Detroit, and in Florida and in Virginia. They're going to see, is Trump carrying places he would have to carry if he's going to, even if not win, but at least make it close. So I think that the ability for Trump to actually claim that, no, I won, we got to stop counting the votes, is going to be extremely narrow. It's going to come down to him actually contesting some really marginal places where it would lead those experts, whether it's on the left at MSNBC or CNN, sort of center left, or Fox on the right. Those people will be saying things like, wow, Trump's doing a lot better in this county than we would have predicted. The polls didn't show these kinds of results. If that does not happen, what you're going to start seeing is Biden carrying states solidly that were question marks, or that in the polls going into it, in the battleground state polls, were showing, it's within the margin of error. Biden's only up by 2 here. And then he comes in and he's up by 3.5, or he's up by 4. That's going to start to become clear by like the middle of the evening next Tuesday. And if that's happening, a narrative will already be laid that will make it impossible for Trump to seriously come out and say, they stole it from me. Because elections are counted at the micro level, and the people on these media outlets know that, again, they know their business. They're going to know, Trump is not winning this if he's not carrying certain places by a certain margin. So I think it's actually quite unlikely now that Trump is going to kind of, try to play dictator and throw the election into chaos. But, of course, in all things, we definitely have experience from 4 years ago. There is a path where that does become possible. If everything is muddied, for instance, if Trump wins Florida and then, Biden comes in a little weak in Arizona, it turns out that's very close, and it's going to take a long time to count there. If Biden ends up being weaker than we would have expected in several states, and then it comes down to these upper Midwest states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and they don't count their ballots for days, then we're in kind of Mudville, and Trump can start to playing out scenarios to justify, his whole narrative of how it's being rigged, it's being stolen, they're flipping the votes, and so forth. So I don't think that that's a likely scenario, but it is a possible scenario. The more likely ones are is that it will be clear earlier than that.
And how would you, because I'm trying to do this, factor in the early vote, which is now a record, it's like, I think it's in the neighborhood of about 70 million. And, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. They're now projecting it could be, the total vote in this election could be north of even 150 million. And the percentage of the voting age population, it could be the highest percentage, going back many, many, many years. Do we go by the general rule of thumb that the higher the turnout, the better it looks for Democrats, for Biden, because the general energy has been, of one of anger against the incumbent here, and that this high turnout vote is a good sign for the Democrats?
I try to resist that conclusion simply because I think there are just too many compounding things that we don't know. Like, it's like, when you're dealing with probabilities, you multiply an uncertainty by an uncertainty. It's not adding them up, you multiply them. And so I think in a lot of states, it probably is the case that the people waiting on these obscenely long lines to cast their ballots and making such a colossal effort to get their vote counted are Democrats, but we also see Trump rallies with 10 or more thousand people showing up and, cheering and rallying for the president in a way that Biden crowds are not doing. Now, a lot of that is because the Biden campaign is actively not trying to hold events because of COVID. But, there's a lot of energy and excitement among some Republicans for Trump, too. Now, I think looking at the polls in the true aggregate sense of trying to gauge what reality is, there are more people on the Democratic side who are excited than on the Republican side. But that's different than your question about the early vote being a sign of this. That I would be very hesitant to do because we just don't know for sure. I know that, for instance, in Florida, Republicans have done a better job than Democrats at signing up new voters in recent years. And so the party registration differential has been narrowing a lot, where the Democrats used to lead the number of registered Republicans by quite a number of votes, by 600,000 or something, and now it's down to like 80,000. So in Florida, maybe a higher proportion than one would expect of the early vote is Republicans. And then, of course, all these votes are equal. And then you mix in the uncertainty of exactly who shows up on election day. And that, too, has many levels of uncertainty based on weather, based on the COVID rates of the different states. For instance, Wisconsin is having one of the worst outbreaks of the virus in the whole country. So that can hold down turnout. And because Republicans are more likely to not wear masks, in general, the recent spikes in the virus have been in more red state areas. So it could be that Republican turnout gets held down by COVID. On the other hand, maybe Republicans are so kind of willing to just risk COVID because they think it's all fake news that they'll show up anyway. So again, that's what I mean by like compounding uncertainties. Mm-hmm. So I sort of try to not conclude too much from that.
All right. So actually, we just a question just came in, which dovetails very nicely with what we were just talking about in terms of a lot of people. Like, I sound like Trump when I say this. Some people say there's a school of thought out there that the early voting, that the surge of it is in part a determination not to be thwarted by Republican vote suppression efforts, which are taking place around the country in different venues. There's been court challenges in all kinds of states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, places like that. And so what I often hear from conservative readers, they'll say, the turnout the last few elections, the midterms in 2018 was so high. So, where's the successful voter suppression? Because people are turning out anyway. How serious do you think should we be taking the various Republican-driven and Trump-driven voter suppression efforts, or is it simply that by overwhelming turnout can neutralize them? No
Well,
matter.
I sort of agree with that, but I mean, there are a couple of levels of this. First of all, I would say we should be making it as easy as possible to vote. And it's kind of morally appalling that large parts of the country make it very difficult. When you see these videos of people who often are African Americans standing in 9, 10, 11-hour lines to cast a ballot, I would love to live in a country where everyone looked at that and was appalled by it and wanted to do something to change it. That said, I do think the practical effect of voter suppression effort could end up being a net gain for Democrats precisely because it leads people to make an extra effort to vote, to show up, to make sure they will not have their votes suppressed. So again, the practical consequence of trying to suppress the vote could be a net gain for Democrats. At the same time, that what I said at the outset, I think still holds, that this is appalling that it has to be that way. I mean, I live in the Philadelphia suburbs. We'll see what happens next Tuesday. I'm actually voting on election day.
I was going to ask you.
I figure if I put on a mask and go to the store, I can put on a mask and go vote. But we'll see if it's different this year. But in all of my years living here for 14 years, I've never encountered more than a 10-minute line to vote there. Well, why is that? Because I live in like an upper middle class, largely white suburb of Philadelphia. But if I drive 3 miles into West Philly to a precinct, I guarantee you I will see a line around the block. And that is just such a rudimentary example of a lack of equity, that it's something we should be up in arms about because of its fairness, not necessarily because it is succeeding in keeping people from voting. It just shouldn't be made difficult, especially people who, unlike me, my life is like you, is spent in Zoom calls, when people actually, despite the pandemic, still have to get up, ride a bus, take public transportation to a physical location and risk their health more than we have to. And then you also say, and you have to take a day off of work so you can vote. It's appalling. So that's, I think, the kind of muddied reality of the voter suppression efforts.
Yeah, I see those videos of people in Atlanta, people of color in Atlanta, standing for 10 hours, 12 hours.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
But there they are, and Georgia's in play, and so you have to kind of, in some ways, take it on board that that's why Georgia's in play, is that these people are determined.
Yes.
To come out, and Biden going to Georgia in the last week of an election cycle, a state that hasn't voted Democrat in whatever it is, probably since Clinton in '92. The fact that he's there is kind of a sign of health for his campaign.
Yes. Yeah.
And Kamala Harris going to Texas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Texas, boy. Now, there you go. If Texas goes blue, then we're just fine on election night. That would be the ultimate sign of a landslide. I mean, probably more than any other conceivable state. I mean, because obviously, it's, first of all, Texas is worth an enormous number of electoral votes. It's heavily Hispanic. It's a state that all the experts think is trending toward the Democrats, but to actually have it tip in this year would be an enormous accomplishment for the Democrats.
The fact that it's even in play at all, and because I hear that the Trump and the Republicans have been losing a lot of ground with suburban voters, college educated suburban voters in and around the metro.
Right.
Around the cities, just like it's been in other places, maybe not at the same rate, but the fact that it's in play. I wanted to ask you about something you said before I forget. A few minutes ago, we were talking about, yes, there's also enthusiasm on the Republican side, obviously, and people are coming to these rallies. And maybe, despite the fact that 225,000 people are dead from COVID and we have 8 million infections, maybe there's truth in what Trump said about how, he could metaphorically shoot people on Fifth Avenue and still retain them. So, a lot of people I know who are like nervous about the election, they say they still can't believe that 40% plus, despite all that's happened, have stuck with Trump. And you and I, before this event started, we were just talking briefly about something that just happened in Nebraska last night. There was a rally for Trump in Nebraska, got 6,000 people. All right, red state, but 6,000 people in the cold. And the event ends, and people all of a sudden their cars are 3 miles away, and the buses that were supposed to take them back couldn't get through or didn't show up. It was very badly organized. So you have all these people standing out in the cold. 7 or 8 elderly people had to get hospitalized for hypothermia. Yeah, and I'm building to my question. So a woman was interviewed, a young woman was interviewed, and I saw the video of this. She was saying, well, what do you think of all this? She's out there chattering. Her teeth are chattering. And she said, and I have the quote here, referring to Trump, she says, I think he did this to teach us a lesson. I really do. And so whoever the interviewer was said, well, what lesson? And she said, oh, what was the lesson? Well, that's really not for me to know. And I don't want to be laughing. These are our fellow Americans. But can you maybe help explain what it is that binds people to him at this point in time, even this point in time, to the effect that they're freezing out in the cold and they've been left out there in like the most massive metaphor I can think of this week?
It's really hard. I mean, I've written so many columns trying to like examine and analyze aspects of it over these last 4 to 5 years since he started running, and I don't have any kind of simple answer. I'll list a series of things. Well, negative partisanship, this phenomenon of our time where people hate the other party more than they like their own. So even if they sort of find Trump, amusing and sort of funny and so forth, the thing that's really getting them excited is they hate Democrats. They hate Joe Biden. They hate Kamala Harris. They hated Hillary Clinton. And Trump is the, Trump is the then the vessel for that hate, the thing that will channel it. Then I think there are definite cultural differences, and you've seen that in the mask wearing conflicts in the country, and not only in this country, but throughout other countries. There have been riots in Italy this week about mask wearing and lockdowns, even though Europe has worse outbreaks of COVID right now than we do. So, and it's not just Italy, like around the world, there is a faction of populations that just don't want to be told by their government to go into lockdown, don't want to be told they have to wear masks. A kind of I'm not anti-authoritarian, because I don't think it's authoritarian in a public health emergency for the government to mandate that you wear a mask in public to stop the spread of a deadly contagion. But anti-authority, a kind of sense of don't tell me how to live my life. And Trump is a kind of exemplar of that sort of attitude of like, up yours, on The Week, my website where I write today. One of the other columnists has a column today or yesterday that was something like, middle finger politics. Like he's the ultimate middle finger. And that then plays also into the what I said before about negative partisanship and the fact that, Trump, they like Trump because they hate Democrats, and just the fact that Trump is here is like a trigger, triggering the libs. Like they love him because he drives people like you and me insane and crazy and makes us, pull what's left of my little fuzz hair out. And so they love that. And then again, and I'll say one last dimension of it, of what probably would be like a dozen if I kept going, is that this cultural difference, the fact, what I think that woman might have been grasping toward when she said, he's trying to teach us a lesson. There is an almost, there is this sense, I think, among a lot of Republicans that, yeah, if another country attacks us and kills a couple of Americans, that's worthy of war. That means bombing them, maybe occupying their country for a decade, pummeling them, showing them who's boss. But if 250,000 Americans die from this pandemic, that's not the president's fault. That's just life, that just like there are poor people, there is cancer, there are tornadoes. It's an act of God. This just happens. We can't blame the president. We can't want a government big enough to fight a pandemic, because then that would be tyranny. We have to just accept that human beings are mortal and they die and they get sick, and we have to not think we can control that. And frankly, maybe this speaks to what the woman had to say about the big mess last night outside Omaha. The government can't even be big or competent enough to organize a rally with some buses to bring their voters home, because if they actually could do that, we would again live in a tyranny. So it's better that I'm walking this road under freezing temperatures for 3 miles to get back to my car. The lesson might be, this is freedom. This is what freedom is that we have a government small and incompetent enough that I am forced to walk back to my car, but at least it's not telling me to put a mask on.
Yeah.
That, to me, it sounds kind of crazy, but I do think that something like that way of thinking is fairly common in certain parts of this country.
Freezing to own the libs. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
But all right. So also within that, sphere, within that the Trump fan headspace, the Hunter Biden narrative. I don't even want to call it scandal, because then it sounds like I'm vetting it. But the Hunter Biden narrative, and about he got all this business with Ukraine supposedly, and then Dad took a piece of the profit, supposedly. That's kind of like gospel within that sphere. But unlike in 2016, it has not resonated far outside the bubble. Maybe because of COVID and the economy and all that other stuff is perhaps getting in the way of it. But there also seems to be other reasons why it has not just metastasized. Let's put it that way. What do you attribute that to? Do you attribute that to better mainstream media vigilance, or I want to put that thought in your head if that's not one of your thoughts on that, but
yeah. Well, I do think that the story of Hunter Biden and his kind of attempt to make a lot of money from influence peddling around his father's power and notoriety as a former senator and vice president is a story. It is something worthy of being covered. The problem is that in our current media environment, we sort of have two extremes. Either if it gets covered by mainstream outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and like a handful of other kind of, and the news pages of the Wall Street Journal, as opposed to the op-ed page, which has been pushing it, then it immediately goes viral, and then the right can weaponize it for partisan gain to say, look, even these biased liberal papers are showing that there's legitimacy to this, and it becomes a kind of snowballing weapon to use against Biden in the campaign by Trump. So that's one extreme. And that we get to that extreme as soon as these mainstream outlets really devote much time, attention, resources to it at all. And then, of course, as we saw 4 years ago with the Clinton story about her emails and the FBI investigation being opened and closed over and over again, and the damage that did to Clinton's campaign, especially in the final 2 weeks. There is an incentive for clicks and traffic at media companies that can lead them to perhaps give more coverage to these kinds of stories than is really kind of objectively warranted by its newsworthiness, simply because it will put the outlet, the media outlet, in the center of the action and get it a lot of attention. So there's that. But then what is the alternative to that? We haven't figured out one. Like, because of the viral character of the way news spreads now with social media, the only alternative is sort of like pretty much total lockdown, shutdown, don't talk about it, don't write articles about it, because the mainstream serious news outlets don't want to be used in this way.
Mhm.
And that's not great because, again, Joe Biden's running for president. It does appear that in some capacity, his son did try to do this kind of vaguely corrupt stuff around Biden, but it's the kind of vague corruption that is endemic in Washington and compared proportionally to the like outright over the top flagrant flamboyant corruption of the Trump administration and his whole family and entourage. It's trivial. So how do you hit that place where you say, yeah, this is important, voters should know this, citizens should be aware of this, and not wanting to have it be, turned into something that somehow seems even worse than Trump? So what we've ended up with is this less than ideal sort of total silence in mainstream outlets about this story, or just very peripheral, small kind of meta stories. So a story about how the New York Post ran with this story and how its sourcing wasn't very great.
All the reporters took his name off it.
Right. So like there are stories about that. So if you want to learn about the story, you learn about it at this kind of second order level in a story about the media rather than the story itself. And again, in the perfect world, that's not great. And of course, then the right, uses that and weaponizes that as more evidence to show, see how biased those mainstream outlets are. They're protecting Biden. Well, in a way, that's true, but I think in a totally justifiable way. They don't want to do to Biden what they did inadvertently to Hillary Clinton the last time, and end up giving fuel to a story that's maybe like 2 or 3 on a scale of 10 in badness, and make it look and be turned into like a 9. And that's actually a responsible thing to do if you're a news outlet. But again, that points to like what a weird world we live in now, where viral news online actually makes it very difficult to come to a proper sense of proportion and judgment about a story.
Right. And also the fact that it was, flogged by Rudy Giuliani,
right?
And where he's at now. I see on your bio that it says here that at one point in your distant past, you were a speechwriter for Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah, I was a speechwriter for Rudy for about 6 months. My boss was Michael Anton, who's the author of the notorious Flight 93 essay defending voting for Trump 4 years ago. And my fellow speechwriter was John Avlon, who is now a big CNN host in the morning show.
Well, here's the question I had. Did you have direct access to Rudy enough to answer the question for everybody listening? How do you explain Rudy Giuliani these days?
I can't. I mean, I did not have very much close. I mean, I was there for 6 months, and I was the junior speechwriter among 3. And my role was basically to write up 500 words for the Dominican American Pride Parade that he was going to. So I was not a senior guy working with him closely on like the State of the City speech or something. That would be Avlon. But I was around. I saw him. I was at many mayoral events in the kind of 6 months before 9/11. And I can't really explain it. I mean, if I If I had a chance to talk with him one-on-one, the thing I'd want to ask him is the thing that I want to ask all these kind of Trumpist Republicans is, just between you and me, off the record, totally concealed, do you believe what you're saying? Or is this all just a kind of BS game where, like, you now think politics means just spouting utter nonsense in the hope of winning? So campaigning, public statements, the things that you get all angry about and drool about on cable news, do you believe what you're saying about Joe Biden being this horrific, terrible, corrupt person who should be in jail? Or are you just saying that because you know there are enough gullible people out there who will believe you and you hope to win doing that? Because I genuinely don't know what is going through the minds of people like Rudy, who have become these kind of ranting lunatics in public. I don't grasp it, because my understanding of what politics is about, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is that you sort of are operating in good faith. You have a certain vision of what the common good of the United States is and what the world should be like and our role in it as a powerful country, and how the economy should be regulated and how taxes should be. And you're working toward making the country more like that. That's the kind of West Wing, meaning the TV show West Wing, kind of, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're operating in good faith. You want to make the country a better country in light of how you understand it and what's good. But these people, the kind of Trumpian faction, it's so thoroughly cynical that I actually don't know if they really care about anything beyond having power and being able to use the power to aggrandize their own financial situation and their own personal gain. So I wish I could ask him, just tell me, which is it? I just want to know. Is there any shred of you that believes what you're saying? Because you sound like a psychotic.
It's one of the tragedies of our era is, it's these enablers. You can say, well, Trump doesn't know any better, but there's a heck of a lot of people who should know better. I mean, I'll give you another example. I don't know that you've thought about her at all, but in the 1990s, when I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer as a political reporter, one of my best sources, one of my most reliable, honest sources on the right was Kellyanne Conway, who was Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, and before she got married to George. And she was terrific. I'd call her. We'd have these long conversations about conservative politics. She was against Clinton and all this in the 90s, but it was all, very above board. I never got the slightest shred of lunatic off her. And even when she was spinning, it was never these outrageous, outright, fantasies. So somewhere along the way, right? I mean, and I have my theories that she was out of the loop for so long, of power, that when she finally got into power and was finally in the loop, she just drank that Kool-Aid completely. That's the only theory I possibly have. But, to me, she's made this complete arc. And I don't know how it's going to be post administration.
Well, I mean, one of the topics that we discussed before we went on the air here was about kind of the future of Trumpism. So maybe this is a good bridge to that, because it really, and I don't have a solid definitive answer to this myself, but I do think there's an advantage to getting people to start thinking about it in the right way. I don't think we fully understand yet what Trumpism is. Like, what is it that's distinctive about Trump? It could be, I think, at least one of two things. And this speaks to your Kellyanne Conway comment and about Rudy as well. Is Trumpism, as a lot of kind of conservative intellectuals like to think, is it a disagreement about policy? So it's a shift from Reaganism. So Reagan was in favor of low taxes, cutting regulations, combined with open markets, a strong foreign policy that defends the liberal international order, and then combining that with kind of open immigration and kind of international capitalism backed up by state power, along with defending human rights around the world and willing to drop bombs on people to advance a certain vision of government. So that's Reaganism. So Trump differs from that because he's anti-immigrant, because he's sort of skeptical of free trade, wants to be much more aggressive in trade agreements. He at least in 2016, he ran, and I think one of the reasons he won is that he spoke as if he wasn't as hostile to, universal health care and the welfare state to help American workers. And then, of course, with trade, he's also, interested in using almost a kind of national economic planning to kind of make sure that American industry thrives. So in all those ways, it's a shift from Reagan. Is that Trumpism? Or is Trumpism actually, and I'm inclined a little toward this latter thing, all of that I just said is sort of superficial. What Trumpism is exactly what the Republican Party has been since Reagan, then channeled through Newt Gingrich and then Paul Ryan, ever lower taxes, ever less regulation on the economy. And now you add in kind of, racism for the sake of certain voters who want that. And then my euphemism that I use in my columns for this is being a jerk. The more accurate term would be a-hole, but I'll give you that rather than the full thing. So dash for the S's in that word. But basically, like a politician who, unlike Reagan, is sunny and talks optimistically and sort of gets all misty-eyed talking about the country as a city on a hill, very romantic vision of America that, a lot of BS. A lot of liberals then didn't like it and still today are skeptical of it, but it was an optimistic, positive vision of the country. To Trump, where he's a kind of ranting lunatic who spouts hate, treats people in the country who don't vote for him as enemies, treats the press as an enemy. If Trumpism is that, it's largely about style, and that includes corruption. So it's a kind of turning the United States into like an Eastern European corrupt kind of thugocracy, where the people in charge are largely in it to line their pockets, who spout nonsense to the masses in order to kind of get them to applaud at rallies, and then while they're not looking, just cut taxes and cut them more, make the government dysfunctional, which makes people like the government less, which makes them more inclined to support cutting it further, and this kind of ratcheting down of the quality of public services. If that's Trump, what Trumpism is, then Kellyanne Conway, I think, makes a little bit of sense, because she's sort of getting a version of what she always wanted. She just had to change how it's being sold. You don't sell it with sunny Reaganite universalistic markets and openness. You sell it with thuggish, kind of bottom-feeding trash talk and nastiness. And she's what, her husband, George Conway, is an interesting case because he couldn't be more anti-Trump, and yet he opposes Trump kind of in a Trumpian style, very vulgar, very nasty. And then on the other hand, you have other Republicans like, say, David French, a writer, and Michael Gerson. Like, there are a whole slew of kind of long-term Republican writers who are repulsed by that stylistic change and will not go for it in any way. So anyway, I'll stop yammering on there. But yeah. I do think that's a kind of mystery that we're going to see in the coming years, is the people who, if assuming Trump loses next week, we're going to have to see who does well. Is it the people who are like Marco Rubio, who sort of want to do the first thing, like kind of shift on policy, but sort of remain a kind of normal Republican in other respects? Or is it going to be like a Tucker Carlson type who has shifted entirely to pure demonization and racism and hate? And like insults and that kind of thing, like that are the Tucker Carlson is the closest to a Trump rally. Is the Trump rally the essence of Trumpism, or is it kind of just a shift in policy priorities? And because like someone like Tom Cotton, who clearly wants to be a new Trump, I don't think he can pull off the nastiness. He has like zero charisma. He's not funny. He's awkward. He's like a geek. And like that is not Trump. And so if the policy wonk side of that debate is right, then Cotton should do very well in a primary. I don't think he's going to do well. I think, I've said this I wrote a column about a year ago predicting that Carlson would be the nominee in 2024,
Yeah.
which is pretty terrifying prospect, because he really, he rants about gypsies. This is a guy who would really be taking the Republican Party even more in the kind of quasi-fascist direction. So that's a scary thought, but I do think he will have more appeal to the people who show up and to Trump rallies in the middle of a pandemic and then wait in line for 3 hours trying to get home in the cold and then thank the president for it.
Well, I mean, a version of what you just said, I'm going to basically reframe slightly, which is that that the fight, if Trump loses, that the fight for 2024, one of these stories for the next few years would be, what is the shakeout going to look like in the Republican Party? Can people who still identify as Republicans, who are really upset with Trump and have basically tried to stay quiet about it, are they going to try to reclaim the party, or is the party going to double down? I remember, and you have to excuse this analogy because I don't like making Nazi analogies. Trump's not Nazi. Trump's not Hitler. I'll get that off the table first. But the analogy I would make is that after when World War II ended, and the whole regime just melted down, all of a sudden you go through Germany, and the soldiers couldn't find anybody who ever identified as a Nazi.
Right.
Nobody was a Nazi. So, are we going to have a lot of Republicans who supported Trump, albeit maybe quietly, saying, "Oh, I never really liked the guy. I'm not for him. I don't want to go in that direction." But are they going to be basically clashing? Maybe not just with Tucker Carlson, but maybe with Donald Jr. Whose noises about he's going to carry the mantle forward.
Yeah, I mean, Don Jr. would clearly be another one who would be very much, in many respects, the successor to Donald Trump. So yeah, he would be kind of fighting in the different lanes. He would be fighting the Tucker Carlson one. Now, I don't know if Tucker's going to run. He might say, yeah, my life's really easy. I'm rich. Why would I want to run for president? So he might not run, but Don Jr. could well end up trying to be the one who tries to mimic his father's act. My instinct, my gut tells me that the attempt to, I think that the party is pretty thoroughly Trumpified. I do not see much of a future for anybody who wants to just kind of go back to Paul Ryan style economic libertarian Reaganite stuff. I just don't see it. And that's on policy. Now, again, Trump has done plenty to make that faction happy. So the real difference is the stylistic one, the combination of nastiness, attacking with the kind of corruption. That's, I think, the future of the Republican Party. Now, where it becomes interesting is is that a party that can still contend for the White House and for Senate and House majorities? Or is that a kind of this is a fun way to put it, is that a rump party, which is kind of Trump without the T. And it's funny that it works out that way, because it really, it could be a rump party. It could be a party that consistently gets, like, has 38% approval, but cannot get within anywhere close to actually winning serious national power. It can win power in state governments, that's for sure. But if you're stuck at 38 or even 40% as your ceiling, you're sort of out. And now the Democrats are sort of a kind of 55% governing party. And that I think is I'm not going to predict that is what will happen, but that is a possible future, because I'm not convinced that that there's going to be national presidential level support for a party that tries to govern and run for office in that way. I just don't see that happening. I think it worked barely in 2016 because of the uniqueness of Hillary Clinton having a lot of people who dislike her. She just rubbed certain groups of voters in certain states the wrong way, combined with her being under FBI investigation, combined with a lot of other kind of unique-ish things that were going on in that context that led people to sort of, enough normal Republicans gave Trump a shot. But I think a lot of those people have abandoned him this time, which is why I still think he's going to lose next week.
Well, all right. So we have, I think, about 4 minutes left, and this is the perfect segue, really, since we're trying to look ahead. One of the things, on the other hand, if Trump's regime ends in January, what they've already managed to do is cement a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, as we learned this week. If Biden wins, how imperiled, let's put it this way, can a lot of progressive legislation, popular mainstream, according to the polls, legislation, be imperiled by the Supreme Court? Is it somewhat analogous to what FDR faced with the Supreme Court that was basically appointed by his Republican predecessors and thwarted a lot of the New Deal?
It might be. I mean,
I was trying to use as a last minute hedge against Biden.
Well, I mean, as we all know how that worked out in the New Deal, that FDR was going to pack the court or add justices who would be more favorable to the New Deal in order to give the New Deal a majority, basically. He didn't do that. It sort of blew up in his face and became, generally considered a kind of act of overreaching. But it, practically speaking, it had the effect of leading the Supreme Court justices who had been opposing him, at least enough of them, to sort of back down. And then they sort of turned on a dime and started saying that a lot of these New Deal policies were actually constitutional after all. Oh, we changed our mind about the Interstate Commerce Clause. Oh, it actually means something different. I do think we're probably going, if Biden wins, we will be in a tumultuous phase of the Supreme Court. I do not personally think that trying to expand the court or pack the court is the right move. I do think that there will be clashes. And if the Supreme Court, with its 6-3 majority, does start trying to strike down major policies of the Biden administration in the way that it almost struck down Obamacare in the first case, where Chief Justice Roberts flipped against the conservatives to keep it. In that case, I think that we might come to a kind of a nullification crisis, where either state governments or the federal government itself decides, well, we're going to ignore you now. Now, I don't advocate that in the abstract, but in the right situation, I could imagine supporting it. To say, in effect, we're going to say, on this, we're not going to allow you to have jurisdiction over this issue because we want to live in a country in which you're allowed to do that. And basically dare the Supreme Court to keep trying and see if the famous line is that the Supreme Court commands no police force or army. I mean, it has no authority to enforce its judgments. And for that reason, chief justices tend to be very cagey about not trying to push contrary to public opinion too much, because they know that if they do, in the end, it's the institution itself that loses. So I think we're going to see a lot of this kind of jockeying for position in the coming years under a Biden administration. But my last word would be that we've seen evidence that already that Roberts is very aware of this. The fact that he flipped on the Obamacare decision, and that he's flipped on a few social conservative cases too, to kind of render to take away the ability of the right to win victories on certain issues where he thinks it would be bad for the court as an institution to do it. Now, if he's truly outnumbered, it won't work anymore, because now there could be a 5-4 majority in the conservative direction, and he could end up siding with the liberals and having no effect. And the fact is that if he doesn't side with the majority, then Clarence Thomas is the one who assigns the authorship to the decision, because he's the most senior justice. So again, it's going to be a mess, and we're going to see how it plays out.
Fun times ahead, everybody.
Always, yes, absolutely.
I guess we'll find out how smart we sound.
I love it, but my opponents online on the right love to cite a column I wrote in the fall of 2016, headlined, Trump is poised to lose in the greatest landslide in American history. They love, anytime they disagree with a prediction of Biden, they just do a screenshot of that headline.
Well, points to you for the humility that journalists need.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, before I sign off, everybody who's watching, I'll just also say that to say thanks for watching, but that 1 week from today during the 12 to 1 o'clock slot, it's just going to be me solo talking, trying to make sense of whatever the heck is going on with the results the morning after. So we'll send out a notice about that as well. So I want to thank everybody, and thank you, Damon.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I'm hoping we can meet up in person in some distant idyllic day.
That would be nice. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to sign off. Bye.